Onboard propulsion is one of the biggest decisions that satellite operators make in the process of designing their spacecraft. The decision impacts the cost, weight, and capability of a satellite, and it can be a challenging one to make because of the technology and fragmented nature of the propulsion market. In this episode of On Orbit, I'm joined by Dr. Daniel Perez Grande, CEO and co-founder of in-space mobility company Ienai Space. Perez breaks down some of the ways the propulsion market is evolving. As the small satellite industry matures and the orbital environment in LEO gets more congested, it's driving a greater need for mobility and onboard propulsion. Ienai Space is developing the Athena thruster, and Perez talks about the company's approach. Also, the company is based in Madrid, and Daniel shares some insight into Spain's startup space industry. I'm Rachel Jewett, and you're listening to On Orbit, the podcast that asks, what's our future in space? Hi, Daniel. Thanks for joining us today on the On Orbit podcast. How are you doing?
Hi, Rachel. I'm great. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, awesome. So I'm excited to get into this issue of space mobility today. But before we get started, I just wanted to hear a little bit about you. Can you tell me about yourself?
Sure. I'm Daniel Perez. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Ienai Space. I have a PhD in plasma physics and nuclear fusion, and I'm an aerospace engineer, both bachelor's and master's. We funded the company 5 years ago, and prior to that, I was working in industry in Rolls-Royce and Airbus for 5 years. So I've been around, aerospace for all of my professional life, starting even at university, and always very fascinated by space and all the progress that's been made. I think over the last years, especially, and how things are moving in this sector. So that's what I can say. I maybe as a personal thing, I also organize or co-organize the local event of the NASA Space Apps Hackathon, which is the largest hackathon in the world, actually, which NASA jointly does one weekend every year, and I'm the co-lead or co-organizer here in Madrid. So also very
Oh,
excited to be involved in the more, I guess, personal or more kind of like outreach side of science and so on.
yeah, that's cool. So what do people try to hack at the hackathon?
So it's actually so NASA together with other, I think, 14 space agencies now. I think the Spanish space agency just joined this year, which is something that we're very proud about, because in fact it's because a lot, it has to do a lot with the work that we've been doing over the last 4 years of organizing this event. Basically these space agencies, they come together, they come up with basically challenges that they might be facing with regards to things that are happening in space, but also things that affect or Earth. So how to use Earth observation or synthetic aperture radar or other kind of like remote observation techniques to basically to make life better on Earth, right? So it's about solving both problems: how to use space to make life better on Earth, and also how to improve what we're doing in space, basically. And basically these challenges are put out for kind of university students or young professionals and so on. They have one weekend to solve it, and then those challenges or those solutions go up to NASA, and they evaluate the solutions and pick some global winners. And I have to say that we were very lucky in 2019 to have one of the teams in Madrid be selected as a global winner when I was organizing that. So very happy
Oh,
about that.
very cool, very cool. So it's more about like making solutions. It's not so much
Yeah.
cybersecurity event. It's about
No,
engineering
it's
solutions.
it's there might be some cybersecurity challenges every once in a while, but it's mainly about like using space to do things better, and or challenges that are coming up with some space missions in the future. For example, we had another team a couple of years afterwards that was involved in creating kind of like a analog memory for a mission to Venus, because obviously you can't take electronics to Venus because they will melt and fry in
Mm.
20 minutes or whatever on the surface. So you need kind of like analog memory so that you can actually store data from the sensors that you're carrying on your mission. So they were like actually designing this analog memory based on some very cool kind of very cool stuff. So yeah, it's you get kind of both sides of things.
Okay, awesome. So Your company, Ienai Space, is focused on propulsion. And when I think about propulsion, I just think, there are so many options out there on the market,
Mm,
and there are a lot of companies trying to do different things. But what I kind of want to get into is what's behind that. So
sure.
I'll start really broad and then we'll see where the conversation goes. But just talk to me top of mind about what are some of the issues with in space mobility and why
Mm.
satellites need to the ability to be mobile in space.
So, I mean, maybe to start with, like we do differentiate within our company, or at least the way that we talk about it, between propulsion and mobility, right? Like most
Okay.
people will say, okay, yeah, propulsion and mobility is the same thing. For us, mobility is a bit of a broader concept that includes the fact that when you have a propulsion system on board a satellite, you also need to take into account what kind of maneuvers that propulsion is going to be, carrying out, how to optimize those maneuvers, if those maneuvers are compatible with the rest of the spacecraft subsystems or with the rest of the spacecraft operations. So actually, when you start looking at this concept of mobility, which you could think of maybe as like, having a GPS that tells you where to go, you need to figure out what kind of engine is going to be, or what kind of thruster in this case is going to be adequate for the trip that you're making, but also what's the best way to make this trip, and whether that all these things are actually compatible with the rest of your satellites. So in fact, mobility, the way that we see it, is a very interdependent problem with a lot of other things in the mission. And perhaps the first issue that we've always seen with this is that because the space sector is heavily separated between satellite manufacturers and propulsion manufacturers, and of course there are examples out there of companies that do vertical integration, such as SpaceX, but traditionally you've seen this separation. That's because that makes sense, because if the know-how that you need to make a satellite is completely different basically from the know-how that you need to make a propulsion system, right?
Mhm.
So when satellite manufacturers go out and pick their propulsion systems, they make their best choices, and as best they can, but potentially, as you said, there's so many options right now in the market that it might be difficult actually to make that choice, and it might not be apparent how that selection of that propulsion system is going to have, let's say, effects or consequences later down the line. So, for example, you may choose a propulsion system that is really good, very highly performant, but that heats up quite a lot, and you might not have taken that into account, as good as you wanted to in your thermal management of your mission. And that means that maybe later down the line, when you're actually operating it, you might not have enough thermal budget to actually operate the propulsion system in the way that you wanted to do this. So if you have that kind of visibility as early as possible, then you have the capability to make basically the better decisions. But it's a very complex problem, right? So it's a very complex problem that is very interdependent with other aspects of the mission. So that's why we talk a little bit about mobility as a broader concept that doesn't only include the propulsion system itself, which we do. We do manufacture propulsion systems, but this concept of mobility is one that we're actually trying to code into a software, so that spacecraft manufacturers can actually make those decisions or have this ability on those decisions from very early on in the mission. And that includes both the capability to let's say, look at all the different kind of propulsion systems that are out there, and the consequences that that's going to have on the rest of your subsystems and the rest of your operations. So maybe to talk about mobility in a kind of like broader terms that we like to
Yeah, that's
use.
an important distinction.
Hmm.
So what are the reasons that satellites need
Hmm.
propulsion and mobility when they're in orbit? Talk to me
Yeah.
about what are the types of things that they might be doing.
Sure. I mean, I think probably most people in the industry are aware that I think the first thing that comes to mind is if you look at Starlink right now, you have a bunch of satellites that are being deployed in orbit, but they're all in the same basically orbit. You need to separate those satellites, right, so that they can come into their configuration that is adequate for that constellation, right? So that is done through onboard propulsion. So these kind of like constellation deployment maneuvers. Of course, station keeping, making sure that your satellites then remain in the orbit in which they're intended to remain for however long the mission is. Collision avoidance, which is obviously something that is happening, more and more right now. We had, I think, back when the Russia carried out their ASAT test, Starlink actually had to do something like 3,000 maneuvers over the course of a month just to avoid the space debris coming from that explosion, right? So you see these things, and it's very obvious, right, that you need some kind of maneuvering on board so that you can do this. And now more and more, and for example, there's an example with the International Space Station now, which is going to be deorbited soon, so that it doesn't become further space junk. Satellites also need to do that, and actually they do, right? Starlink deorbits their satellites. OneWeb deorbits their satellites.
Mhm.
Kuiper from Amazon will deorbit their satellites. So if you're in a high orbit, and you don't have enough drag to do that naturally, then you're going to need to come down and basically deorbit, in the right time, so that your satellite is still functional while you're doing that, and you don't contribute to this growing issue of space junk. So I think mobility, in space is a very obvious part of the problem. I think we've always had it. And you were asking before about, like, what are some of the issues, regarding to mobility. And I think one of the interesting things to point out is that presently there are about 50% of the satellites over the last decade that were not Starlink. So if you exclude Starlink, right,
Okay.
50% of the remaining satellites that were launched to orbit that actually not have any kind of onboard propulsion system on board. And that's mainly has to do with the type of spacecraft that they were. So, like, small, CubeSats or whatever. But some of the professional, like, spacecraft, maybe the ones that were made, for example, by Planet, the Doves, they also did not carry propulsion, right? So you could argue that it's a question. It's always a question as to, like, why, if propulsion seems to be so necessary, why do these kind of smaller spacecraft have not been incorporating propulsion up until kind of very recently, or are still not incorporating propulsion? So those are some of the issues, and I think again, it's very obvious, I think, what needs to be, or why mobility is required in orbit. It's more of a matter of, are the solutions that are out there the right solutions for the satellites that we're seeing coming online today?
Yeah. How is it like how does it work when a satellite doesn't have propulsion?
So, I mean, if you look at, for example, going back to the example of Planet, right? So they were deploying their Earth observation constellation very successfully, by the way. So, kudos to them. I think they launched something like 400 doves. And it's true that Planet probably did not require basically a very homogeneous constellation. They didn't require a very homogeneous separation between the satellites. So they were kind of launching them, waiting for the sides to kind of like drift apart, and then using them to create more and more and more data. But in fact, towards I think they're not using the doves anymore, but towards the end of I think that mission, they were starting to look at things like differential drag, which is a technique that you can use when you don't carry onboard propulsion to separate your satellites in a faster manner. The problem with that is that differential drag, which basically implies slowing down the satellite against the atmospheric drag so that it can separate from other satellites. It actually consumes satellite lifetime, because what it's doing is it's slowing it down, so it's going to deorbit much faster at the end of the day. So they were basically sacrificing this kind of lifetime of their satellites so that they could kind of have a bit more homogeneity in their constellation. If they would have had a propulsion system, they would not have had to do this. And in addition to that, they could have done it much quicker, because it took them something like a year to deploy this kind of like in this manner, right? So yes, spacecraft that don't have propulsion exist out there. I have to say that now, with the regulations that are coming online by the FCC and also Congress, and also ESA over here in Europe, basically, I think it's going to be very difficult to launch a satellite without propulsion to orbit in the coming years. And in fact, as far as I know, the Falcons are already requiring some kind of maneuvering capability for the satellites to come on board, and it makes sense, right? Because at the end of the day, particularly for SpaceX, which obviously they're very interested in ensuring the safety of their own constellation, which is now a huge asset. What happens if you're putting things out there that just don't have the capability to get out of the way if there's going to be a collision, right? So you want to, the more and more assets that we put out there, it's just natural that these things are actually starting to come in practice, not only because there are regulations, but because the industry will demand it, so that you're putting things out there that are very expensive. You don't want to collide with other satellites, and if both satellites satellites have propulsion, then your chances of actually not having a collision are much higher, right? So, those are, I would say, some thoughts on
Yeah.
how things work, but it probably won't be working like that in the near future.
Yeah, so it sounds like the tide is really shifting toward onboard propulsion, but I'm sure that comes with there's some, the added cost and then the mass
Yeah,
on the spacecraft that has to be
yeah,
accommodated.
yeah.
So yeah.
100%. Yeah, I mean those are huge issues. I think traditionally propulsion has been, together with the payload, probably the most expensive subsystem in the satellite.
Okay.
I mean, space industry is kind of opaque about pricing, as you probably know. So very, very difficult to know really, what are the prices out there. But there's some figures of merit that basically say that a propulsion system could be something like 25% of the cost of satellite, right? That is a lot. That is a
Yeah.
very expensive system. And yeah, and it adds to the mass as well. And in fact, what's interesting here, and what's interesting here is how the industry has evolved, right? To I think kind of tackle both issues. So regarding mass, for example, like that was the original reason why we had electric propulsion versus chemical propulsion, right? So electric propulsion, by the way, is what we do at Ienai Space. So we do a type of electric propulsion system called Space, which is originally was developed by NASA back in the 60s or 70s, then was picked up again by MIT, kind of like turn of the century, early 2000s, and over the last kind of 20 years, it's been picking up force as one of the potential kind of technologies that might be next generation technologies, if you want to call them
Hmm.
that. But the original reason why you had electric propulsion versus chemical propulsion was because you could save a ton of propellant mass. And in fact, the kind of like the rule of thumb there was that for the geostationary satellites, right, the big thousands of kilogram satellites, basically you could save about half the mass of the satellite, not half of the mass of the propellant, but half of the mass of the whole satellite by switching from chemical to electric. The downside was that the maneuvers took much longer, right? That's the typical case with electric propulsion. But in fact, if you look at what's been happening in the space industry over the last basically 10 years, you see that something like 65% of all satellites carry electric propulsion versus 20% that carry no propulsion at all, right? Which is the ones that I was referring to earlier. And then versus something like 14% or 15% that carry chemical propulsion, or maybe don't carry propulsion because it's not 100% clear on every case if a satellite is actually carrying propulsion or not. So electric propulsion is basically dominating, right? It's a
Hmm.
technology that is dominating. That's just because of the fact that it just saves so much mass, right? So with the propellant. Now the problem is that when you start to scale down to smaller and smaller spacecraft, the physics of some electric propulsion systems, or most electric propulsion systems, don't really allow you to do this in a very efficient way. And that means that you will kind of start to consume more of the mass and more of the power ratio, let's say, of a satellite versus a larger satellite, right? Because you're trying to miniaturize these propulsion systems.
Yeah.
You're not really doing that much of a great job, and then unfortunately you're just consuming more and more of this mass, which is why it becomes prohibitive. And that's the reason also why most small spacecraft, is 20% that I was talking about over the last 10 years, just have not carried any kind of propulsion system to orbit. So that's one issue. And then the other issue is price. And I think price can really only be resolved by assuming that we are in a very different situation right now in the space market than what used to be at 20 years ago, where you would do basically one off or two off, or maybe like a batch of like 10 propulsion systems for satellites,
Hmm.
and that would be it, right? And you could charge basically whatever you wanted, because there weren't that many people doing it. Now, as you said, there's so many options out there. There's so much competition. I actually, this is kind of interesting. If you look at the number of companies, and this is not to say anything, of course, the US is where the market is. But if you look at the number of companies, there's more companies doing propulsion in Europe than there is in the US.
Like,
Although there's more competition, obviously, and the market is in the US, and et cetera, et cetera. But if you look at number of companies, it's crazy to see that there's more in Europe than there is in the US. So I think this whole competition worldwide is just kind of tackling this issue of prices and really bringing it down to something more like 15%, 10% of a satellite's cost, which is really where it should be. And as soon as you start to mass produce and stuff like that, you can probably even bring that down a little bit lower.
So it sounds like this is a market that is really in flux right now as
Mm,
more and more satellites are putting onboard propulsion, and there's all of these providers, but I'm not sure how many of them have like truly scaled up that
sure,
much. So it
sure.
sounds like there's a lot of, this is a big time of flux.
Yeah, no, for sure. And that this has always been one of the, the difficult points to discuss with our investors or, people that we were trying to
Yeah.
convince or to come in to come on board the company. The propulsion market is it's been a difficult market, I think, to sell. I think as I agree with you that there's very few companies that are actually have the capability to deliver a propulsion system that has high reliability. To be completely fair, we haven't done that yet either. We are preparing for, well, actually, we did have one flight of an experimental version of our propulsion system a couple of years ago, and now we're preparing for 2 to 3 more flights next year, and that will hopefully give us basically a good kind of initial point on reliability and the capability to deliver those propulsion systems to orbit. But you're right, there's many companies trying this, whereas maybe there won't be that many companies actually executing. I think, in fact, if you look at worldwide, I don't expect more than 10 to 15 companies to actually be providing these kind of propulsion systems, which incidentally is probably what you will get with launchers too, right? So with space launchers, you probably won't have more than, again, 10 to 15 companies, I think, worldwide that are actually competing and on the market. So
Mhm.
it's a very interesting market. It's a very technical market to get into, of course,
Yes.
because you need to
Right.
you need
Yeah.
to have that capability.
So that was kind of my next question is you
Mhm.
mentioned that the skill set to build propulsion is completely different than to build a spacecraft bus. So
Mhm.
if you have uh the leaders of a company or the people doing procurement, they might be more versed on the bus side.
Mhm.
Can that be a challenge to evaluate
Yeah.
propulsion systems when you're not familiar, not as, immersed in the technology?
Look, I think it is. In my opinion, I think it is a challenge. And in our experience, when we've spoken with, especially companies that were kind of like startups like us, early stage, I think it is very difficult for them to evaluate the right propulsion system for their mission. And it ends up being more of what's available, what can I put out there, and we'll just try to use it as as we can, and so on. But I've had experiences from kind of like integrators that were like, this doesn't fit. We need to add a bigger battery because like the propulsion system is just going to take up all the battery that we have right now. And then that changes. And then maybe that affects some other things. And so it is a very delicate balancing act to add a propulsion system and then to operate it afterwards. So, from more experience, I think it is. Yeah, I think it is a challenge to do that. Thankfully, and not to pitch in what we're doing, but we are kind of very aware of this issue, and we are working on a software tool that we call 360, which is we call it a mission and space mobility analysis tool, basically. So what that does is it's a tool that is similar to other tools out there in the industry in the sense that it can do mission analysis, so it can look at orbits, design orbits, it can look at subsystems and things like that, but it can also do that from the perspective of the mobility side. So what that brings to us, our biggest differentiator is that we can include that part specifically, which most mission designers don't know that much about, or perhaps haven't had that much experience with, right? So we can add that, add that value there, while we cover all of the rest of the use cases that are needed for a mission analysis to be carried out.
Mhm.
So I think we're working on that. I think the market's going to be interested in looking at that, because again, the more and more we go into constellations and the more traffic there is in orbit, mobility is just going to become something that is much more crucial, and you're going to need to really understand it and look into it in depth as early as possible.
Absolutely. You mentioned that operating the propulsion system is another thing. So what
Mhm.
are some of the issues and concerns with that?
So yeah, operating a propulsion system can be very difficult. So for example, if you had a chemical propulsion system, because your thrust is very high, if you're not actually able to, let's say, orient the propulsion system or the spacecraft perhaps in the right way, or actually ensure that your attitude control systems are actually working in a way that they can take what the thrust that is being given by the spacecraft or by the propulsion system, you can come into tumbling modes and things like that, which can
Mhm.
really screw up your mission. And that's actually happened before. In addition, again, as I was saying before, these things get hot. You're going to need to deal with that from the thermal perspective, so that's always going to be an issue. And in the case of electric propulsion, particularly, there's a couple of more things which you need to take into account. One is that you're actually driving, the power that you're using from the battery, which means that you need to take into account, what's your soil power generation, what's your consumption of all the other systems. Are you actually going to be able to use your propulsion system together with other subsystems in the spacecraft, or do you need to turn things on and off so that you can do the maneuver? And also, because electric propulsion systems are low thrust, the optimization of the maneuver, so the way that you actually carry out the operation of the propulsion system to achieve a maneuver that saves as much power or as much propellant as possible, is
Mhm.
actually not straightforward at all. And there's a ton of, let's say, developments that have gone into trying to optimize the way that we use these systems to, again, save more and more propellant or save more and more power. But it's not something that you can just kind of like do a back of the envelope calculation.
Mhm.
You really need to look into it, and that's in part also some of the things that we do with our software tools.
Okay.
So yeah, those are some of the issues that you can expect, I think, when operating a propulsion system. So I think establishing a really good relationship between your propulsion provider and that satellite manufacturer that you're selling to is really key to ensuring that, again, that you're throughout the whole lifetime of the mission. So from early design to integration to operations, that you're covered with the right know-how.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned that it can take some like in-depth calculations to figure out what the right maneuver is. So it sounds like that's something that's a little bit complicated to automate. Like people are still very involved in executing
Oh yeah.
maneuvers.
Yeah, yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, in fact, we're working right now with an institution here in Spain that they sent out a cluster of satellites, and they don't have or propulsion systems on board, but they need to keep the cluster information, and just automatizing that in a way that, again, kind of like optimizes the way that you do this, so that you save as much let's say resources as possible, is not straightforward at all. So these are complex problems, and we this all goes back to the idea of mobility. For us, mobility doesn't only mean propulsion. It means, how do you choose the right propulsion system at the beginning of the mission? How do you ensure that propulsion system is going to be compatible with the rest of the subsystems in the spacecraft? And when you're down to operating it, are you actually going to be able to operate it in the right way, and that in a way that's compatible with the rest of the operations of the spacecraft? And when you're operating that propulsion system, are you going to be sure that you're operating it in the most efficient and optimal way possible, so that you can save on the resources or the budgets of the spacecraft? And all of this, it's actually a very complex problem that has a lot of interdependencies, as I was saying, and that's what it means for us to talk about mobility, right? Again, we're not only working on the propulsion systems, we're working on trying to provide all of these insights and know-how to our clients, end to end. So from start of the mission to all the way to the end of the mission.
Yeah, I like how you're explaining it as something that needs to be taken into account from the beginning of the mission planning.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me a little bit about Ienai Space's approach. And you mentioned that there was a story behind the name of the company, so I'd love to hear that.
Sure. So yeah, Ienai is a very, I think, a typical name. I think English natives struggle with pronouncing it. It's actually a Greek word. It's Old Greek, and it's actually the verb to go in Old Greek. And the reason why we picked it is because it's also the origin of the word ion, and we do ion propulsion, right?
Okay.
Electric propulsion is also called ionic propulsion. And basically, when Michael Faraday was figuring out that there were some particles out there that were charged, he asked a colleague over in Oxford, and they kind of came up with, well, in Old Greek, to go from one place to another is Ienai, and they derived the word ion from that. So
Mhm.
because we help satellites to go from one place to another, we also do ionic propulsion. We chose Ienai for the for kind of like that backstory,
Nice.
and we're very proud of it. But as a company, so we founded the company 5 years ago, back in 2019. Myself and my two co-founders, which we actually met during our PhDs, and then, well, at the moment we are 22 people in the company. We're basically hiring this year up to 30 something, 30 plus people. So still a small company. We're still very kind of like in development phase, but kind of starting to come out with our first potential contracts out there on the table. We have a pipeline of clients that are interested in both our software and hardware solutions. We already have some clients for our software solutions. So yeah, so we're very interested in, we're pushing towards basically reaching that commercial stage, that full commercial stage, which is going to allow us to then go on to the next stage, which is basically scaling up mainly the propulsion production capabilities. And we just closed a round. We were very happy to announce that we just closed a almost $4 million round, a bit more than a month ago, which is basically going to allow us to reach that almost pre-scaling phase, right? So I think this is something that we've been chasing for the last couple of years. Of course, the last couple of years, everybody knows that have not been amazing for fundraising. So
Right.
it's taking us a bit longer than we expected, but we're here now, and basically it's giving us the resources that we need to ensure that we reach the next stage of the company.
Yeah, absolutely. When you are going out to raise money, do you think it's that propulsion is a more difficult part of the market for investors to understand?
Look, it's been very difficult. I always have to say, I won't say with who, but I'll have to say that the best conversation I ever had with an investor was a 6 month technical conversation with a partner that was actually a physicist himself. So he was, able
Wow.
to really get down into, it was a very, very deep tech fund here in Europe. And, he was able to really get down into the specifics. And we talked for 6 months, probably 2 or 3 times a week. It was, very intense about the market, the technology, et cetera. And at the end, they said no. And to be honest, I'm still saying, like,
Oh
that was
man.
probably yeah, but that was honestly still the best conversation that I've ever had with an investor on it. And it is a hard market, as you said. There's so many players right now. It's difficult also to know what's going to happen in terms of volume of the market, because of course, as a propulsion manufacturer, you depend on the actual number of satellites that is going to be
Yes.
sold or sent over to orbit over the next whatever years. And if all of that is Starlink, then you're not going to be selling anything, right? So you kind of really have to convince people that no, there will be. So you're not only convincing people that there is a market for propulsion, which there is, and of course, again, Starlink carries their own propulsion systems. If that was externalized to a provider, I'm sure that provider would have made a lot of cash, let's say.
Yeah.
That's not how it worked. But you also have to convince that the whole space industry, the whole space market is going to traction beyond what we're seeing now with Starlink and other mega constellations, or that there will be enough mega constellations out there, or big constellations, that ensures that you're going to have enough satellites, enough volume of satellites. So it's a very difficult conversation. And again, yeah, the example that I mentioned, I think is a testament to that. But thankfully, there were other investors that were more convinced on what we were doing, and we were able to bring them on board. Yeah, as I said a couple of months ago.
Yeah, congratulations on the round.
Thank you.
I understand that you also had a milestone with the thruster. There was a test. Can you tell me about that?
Sure. So we are, this is, I would say very typical. So we are in a, let's say, in a project with the European Space Agency, where they're basically providing us with support so that we are able to reach the commercial stage for the thruster, right? So ESA, one of their goals is to ensure that the European industry is, competitive and high tech, and all that kind of stuff, and state of the art. And they will provide basically support and helping you to reach that stage. And I think NASA also does this, and so on. So it's very typical, I would say, within the space industry. So we have that project with the European Space Agency. Actually, a few projects that are helping us advance different price, different subsystems, or different characteristics of our thruster. And one of the major milestones that we had, and this is also coming from something that they were very interested in, which was to early on be able to demonstrate the capability of the thruster to operate for long periods of time.
Mm.
Because at the end of the day, when you have an electric propulsion system, that means that you're going to have to operate it typically for hundreds to thousands of hours, typically thousands of hours, in fact. And for us, because at the moment the thruster that we are working on, which is by the way called Athena. We're working on a 0.5 U system, so half a U if you are talking about CubeSat units. So very, very small and compact thruster. And our commercial target for that is 1,000 hours. And we were able to reach a milestone in the development, which is still kind of like TRL 6 or so, where we were able to reach 40% of that let's say total operating time, which was the basically what ESA had asked for. So as far as we know, that is, at least within Europe, that is like the longest firing of an electrospray thruster that's come out, at least publicly reported and independently verified. So we're very happy about this milestone because it really shows that we're very close to reaching that limit that we want to reach for our commercial, let's say, our commercial products. And yeah, so very happy about that, and also happy to be considered a first, at least as I said, publicly reported.
Yeah, congratulations. So what is different, what is special about the Athena thruster?
So Athena has a number of things that are special about it. So again, it always goes back to the idea that we're using electrospray systems, and not to get into much into the details, but all of the electric propulsion systems that have been done up until now, or most of them, the most common ones, gridded ion thrusters, Hall effect thrusters, they're all plasma-based technologies. This means that you have to ionize a gas and then exhaust it from the thruster using either electric or magnetic fields. And that is actually pretty efficient at high powers. So if you look at, for example, I think Starlink reported something like 50% efficiency at 2.5 kilowatt power, which is actually really good numbers because they're also running it on argon, as far as I remember. But you typically can get really high efficiency. If you move that to xenon, you're probably going to get something like 70 to 80% efficiency, which means that 80% of the power that you're putting in is being converted into thrust, which is what you want, right, with an engine. As you start to scale down to lower powers, unfortunately, plasma-based systems are just not great because you have a lot of inefficiencies. That kind of like 20-30% efficiency or inefficiency that I was talking about starts to become bigger and bigger as you scale down to lower powers. And at the end, you might end up with systems that have something like 10% efficiency, 15% efficiency, which is really not what you want in a thruster, right? What you want is to put power in, get thrust out. If you're only getting a tenth of the power that you're putting in converted as thrust, that's not so great. So you need to look at the problem again, and you need to look at different technologies that allow you to retain higher efficiencies at low powers. And when I say low powers, our propulsion system runs around 20 watts of power, which is, you probably don't even have a light bulb that is 20 watts in your own house, right? So,
Yeah.
or maybe you do, maybe
Well,
some
no, I
LEDs,
just
right?
meant
Maybe
sure.
some LEDs, yeah. But so it's so we're talking about really low power. Of course, we have the capability to scale to higher powers, but what we saw was that there was an entry into the market for these, again, that 20% of satellites that are being launched today or over the last decade that just didn't have any kind of propulsion system on board, where if you reach low powers with high efficiency, you were able to come into the market with them. And that's been our focus since day one. And it has to do with the mechanisms, the physical mechanisms that govern the electrospray basically emission, which is basically using these things called molten salts or ionic liquids. So instead of using a gas that you have to ionize, you actually have a stable liquid that you can pull ions out from. So it's kind of like if you dissolve just tabletop salt into water, that kind of like dissociates into the two ions. If you can pull those out of the water, you would actually have a very efficient mechanism of producing thrust. And that's what you do. You use a different kind of propellant for it. Again, these ionic liquids, but it's very, very efficient. And this allows you to really work at low powers and give to clients something that they can actually really use. Because if you have, again, a propulsion system that's just 10% efficient, that's not going to be the product that you really want. That's one aspect of it. The second biggest aspect for us is customization. When we started to look into the space industry, we figured out, or one of the things that we saw was that there's basically no customization options for propulsion systems. When you make a propulsion system, you make it typically for one mission or maybe a few missions, a few satellites. But those satellites might end up needing to adapt their own spacecraft to fit your propulsion system, because you're not going to make a new propulsion system for every new spacecraft that comes around. And what we saw was that, in fact, you look at what has happened over the last 20 years, and there's been so many different kinds of spacecraft out there, so many different volumes, so many different shapes, so many different mass budgets. And what you really should be doing is, you shouldn't be forcing the satellite integrator to say, well, these are the options that I have for propulsion out there. I'm going to need to reorganize or redesign my spacecraft around the propulsion system, which is in fact what is happening even today in many cases. What you should be doing is, look, this is the spacecraft that I want to carry out. I have this much room more or less for propulsion, this much power. What can you give me? And is that capable of meeting the requirements that I have for this mission, right? So you should be able to kind of like tackle this problem in an inverse manner where you're actually designing your propulsion system around the spacecraft and not the other way around, which is the way that makes sense. And the way to do this, or the way that we have done this, is basically by having a building blocks approach. So we have separated the or propulsion system into three parts, basically the thruster itself, the electronics, and the propellant management systems. And basically all of those parts are manufactured in a way that they can be stacked depending on if you need more power, more thrust, or more propellant on board. And that actually allows us to configure the propulsion system in a way that is basically uniquely tuned to every single mission out there. We can then also clusterize that propulsion system, that kind of like initial module, so that you can go up to, let's say, a bit of a higher power, closer to 80 watts of power. And in the future, we will also have some larger options in terms of power, so that we can start to work with, let's say, bigger satellites of the order of hundreds of kilograms, and so on. So yeah, this building blocks approach and the customization, I think, is something that is also very differentiating.
Hmm. Yeah. Thanks for that rundown. That's interesting, especially you know, the building blocks approach, I think is really
Yeah.
interesting. One thing I was curious that you had mentioned was that there are a lot of propulsion startups in Europe. Why
Hmm.
do you think that is?
So I think, I mean, it's the same reason why there's a lot of launcher startups in Europe. If you look at the number, if you, there's a LinkedIn page called, I think, Spaceflight Today or something like that. If you look at it, they have these posters. It's a European spaceflight, and they have these posters for every country, right? That's in Europe. The launchers are being made by startups in every country,
Mhm.
and you sometimes you see three or four or maybe five. So, and that's per country. There's 27 countries in Europe, right? So, um, so there's so many companies here trying to really breach that market, which means that, and I was talking to an American investor some weeks ago, and she was saying, there's more competition in the US. And I said, I don't think there's more competition in the US. I think there's better competition in the US
Mm.
because you have enough startups, enough companies to actually compete, but the pie, the capital, the funding pie that they're sharing, the project pie that they're sharing is more unified, right? Because it's a single country, right? Whereas in Europe, what you have is a lot of the countries are not really cooperating among themselves. Of course, we have the Ariane 6, which just launched, and it's a big pan-European collaboration. But if you look at the startups, they're mainly locally funded by European investors from that particular country.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think that at the end that's the issue. We have a very, when it comes down to the space market, it's still, and the capital markets, it's still very heavily fragmented. And maybe, as I said before, like, the investors I was talking to before, they were from other European countries. And at the end of the day, what are they going to do? They're going to invest in a company that's in Spain, or in a different country from their own, or they're going to look for the startup that is in their own country and maybe invest there. And that's typically what tends to happen, because there's also a lot of public financing, which that the companies can leverage on top of the private financing. So I think, yeah, it's very, very fragmented. I think our competition is more intense, at least in terms of numbers, but is definitely much worse in terms of, let's say, the resources that we have to compete, which means that there's probably going to be some consolidation, I think, also in the market, coming in the very near future, because it's not going to be sustainable to have, again, like 50 launcher companies or 50 onboard propulsion manufacturers in Europe, when especially when the European market is something like 10% of the global market versus the American market, which is something like 70% or something like that. So
Mhm.
yeah, I think it's an issue of how Europe works, I think, and I think we need to do better at that, and have a more pan-European view if we want to really uh, yeah compete on the global stage.
Mhm. Yeah. So with Ienai being based in Madrid, I'm just curious,
Hmm.
what's the space startup environment look like in
Hmm.
Madrid or also in Spain?
So, you wouldn't think of Spain as a country that has a lot of, let's I think it's coming together, I think it's coming together. We actually have PLD, which was the first private
Yes.
company to do a micro launcher launch. It was a suborbital launch, but they
Yeah.
did achieve it in
And
Europe. So I think
they just received some backing from a
yes.
group of Spanish banks that I think earlier this
Yep.
week or late last
30,
week.
30 million. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. 30 million backed by Spanish banks on top of 40 million from their recent round. So I think they're well poised towards potentially, yeah, being a player for micro launchers. Of course, the micro launcher market is, we've seen that with Astra and Firefly and Rocket Lab, right? It's a tough market, right? It's a tough market to beat the Falcons, I think. But yeah, I think we'll see. I think we'll see what will happen and how they will progress. So yeah, we have that. I think that's really probably put Spain on a little bit on the map in terms of space startups. And we have everything really. I mean, if you look at the value chain of companies that are doing or working on the space sector, we have people, satellite manufacturers, we have payload manufacturers, we have subsystem manufacturers. In reality, you can end to end, create a spacecraft in Spain and start to provide services. In fact, there are companies that are doing that. We work with a number of companies that, for example, are providing IoT services from space. There are a few companies that are doing Earth observation. So yeah, there's it's coming together. I think again, Spain is not necessarily known for the space industry, or not that well known, although it has been substantial. I think over the last 40 to 50 years. But now the space startup scene is really becoming, I think, very interesting. And maybe to add something in addition to this, which is again kind of like my world, which is propulsion, right? There's
Yeah.
another company which is Pangea Aerospace, which is doing aerospike engines, which is something that, in fact, has not really been attempted that much since NASA tried it back in the 90s, I think. So there is a really, I think, a hunger to innovate. There is a drive to innovate, to put ourselves in the map as a spacefaring country. And for example, talking about our own company, and Spain has never had an electric propulsion system developer before. No one that did that before. And not only are we now kind of like consolidated within the country, but we're also developing a technology that is, in our view, next generation technology, right? So there is, I think, that drive to really innovate and differentiate. And I think one of the things I really do like is that everyone that works here in the space industry is really looking at the market worldwide and really trying to compete in that worldwide market. And coming from a relatively small country, I think that's it takes guts to try to look at the global stage and try to compete on that front. So yeah, very very happy to be here, and yeah, very interesting to see where it will go in over the next few years.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, it's been great to talk with you, Daniel, and really dig into some of the issues around in-space mobility and hear more about what Ienai Space is doing. So I wish you guys the best of luck, and thanks so much for joining the show.
Thank you so much, Rachel. It's been a pleasure, and I think the conversation has been tremendously insightful. So thank you for the questions.